Welcome to today's webinar, Rural Renaissance, Revitalizing America's Hometowns Through Clean Power, hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning in association with the Smart Growth Network. My name is Michael Bayer. I'm the Manager of Infrastructure and Development at the Maryland Department of Planning and Project Manager for the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse. The Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse is a project of the Smart Growth Network, supported by the US EPA's Office of Community Revitalization and managed by the Maryland Department of Planning. In addition to hosting webinars, the Smart Growth Information Clearinghouse has a website at smartgrowth.org that provides information on effective growth, development, and preservation practices. The Clearinghouse provides information to help local decision makers foster healthy, resilient, and economically vibrant communities. The Clearinghouse is also the virtual home of the Smart Growth Network, a nationally recognized coalition of leadership organizations that have formally endorsed the principles of smart growth. This webinar is one in a series of webinars produced by the Maryland Department of Planning on smart growth and planning topics, available for viewing at smartgrowth.org. You can also find out about planning initiatives, planning tools, and educational opportunities in Maryland by visiting the Maryland Department of Planning's website at planning.maryland.gov. We are recording this webinar and will be posting it on our website under the Webinar Archives tab. We encourage you to visit the website and to subscribe to our e-newsletter to learn about our upcoming programs. The views expressed by the speaker in this webinar are those of the speaker and not necessarily of the Maryland Department of Planning or the state of Maryland. Viewers of this live event are eligible to receive 1.5 CM credits from the American Planning Association, as well as 1.5 CNUA CEU self-reported credits from the Congress for the New Urbanism. To log your AICP credits, visit the American Planning Association's website at planning.org, log into your account, and search for the name of today's event, which is Rural Renaissance, Revitalizing America's Hometowns Through Clean Power. You can also search for event number 925-6616. I'd like to acknowledge our webinar partner today, Island Press, and their partnerships manager, Jen Hawes. Founded in 1984, Island Press's mission is to provide the best ideas and information to those seeking to understand and protect the environment and to create solutions to its complex problems. So today our speaker is Michelle Moore. Michelle Moore is CEO of Groundswell, a nonprofit that builds community power through community solar, clean energy, and resilience programs. Since joining Groundswell in 2015, she has helped the organization deploy equitable solar and clean energy models that share power, savings, resilience, and opportunity for families regardless of household income or credit score. From 2009 to 2011, she served as the Obama administration's Chief Sustainability Officer, where she launched the Green Gov initiative, which engaged federal agencies and the military services to improve energy use. She also worked with the President's Job Council to launch the Better Buildings Challenge, which implemented $4 billion in public and private investment in building energy efficiency. She later served as a senior advisor to the director of the White House Office of Management and Budget. Early in her career, Michelle served as Senior Vice President of the U.S. Green Building Council and began her career in sustainability in 1997 as Director of E-Business for Interface Incorporated in her hometown of LaGrange, Georgia. Michelle earned her bachelor's in political science from Emory University and a Master of Science in Foreign Service from Georgetown. Following her presentation, Michelle will answer as many questions as time permits. You can submit a question anytime by using the questions tool located on the control panel on the right side of your screen. And as always, for those who have been here before, we're going to start with a couple of polls, actually 3 today. The first one is just asking where the folks in the audience live and work, and you can see the options on your screen. If you are having any issues in responding to the poll questions, you may need to exit from full screen mode. So we'll give everybody a few seconds here to respond. And thank you for being with us today. As always, there's quite a geographic distribution of the folks with us, and it's always interesting to see where people are from. It does vary from program to program. We'll give you a couple more seconds to respond. I think we have quite a wide distribution today. So today, 28% are from the South, 24% Mid-Atlantic Northeast, 23% the Midwest, 19% from the West, and 6% outside of the continental US. Another poll question specific to our topic today. And this is just asking, given the content today, where you live. And you can tell us how you define it as a rural community, a small town, a suburb, or a city. You can select one of these options. Just gives everybody and Michelle a little bit of context of who is here today based on the topic. And again, we'll give everybody a few seconds to respond. Thank you for participating in this. A few more seconds here for everybody. So of the people who've responded today, 42% say they live in a city, 29% suburb, 19% small town, and 10% in a rural community. Finally, we have one more poll question. And that is, I live in an area served by, and you have three options: a rural electric cooperative, municipal or public power utility, or an investor-owned utility. And so if you know the answer to that and can respond, we'll give you a couple seconds to do so. And then we'll move into our presentation today. And again, thanks for participating in this. Okay. And the response today, 59% municipal or public power utility, 30% investor owned, and 12% in a rural electric cooperative. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Michelle Moore. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you so much. And it is absolutely wonderful to be here with you all today. I am delighted to be able to share this conversation and share a beautiful afternoon. I am, let's see, I'm going to share my screen here and get us rolling. You know, and I wanted to say, I think it's just so, and let me check and see, can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. A little technologically challenged occasionally on my side here. I think it's so appropriate in so many ways that we're having this conversation together at the beginning of Climate Week New York City, NYC, which is actually where I'm joining you from today. Because for so many years in the energy and climate movement and the sustainability community, and I say this about myself too, as a 25-year veteran of the field, that so much of our focus was really shaped by the metrics that we prioritized. And by the sometimes technocratic culture of the work. You know, if you're focused solely on reducing climate pollution, reducing GHG emissions, what we look at is cities. What's the economic activity in our cities, like transit, transportation, building energy use, waste management, including solid waste and stormwater and storms and black water waste. We look at cities. And similarly, we look at big corporate users of energy. We look at big corporate polluters and really focus our activities there on cities and on corporations. But when we widen our metrics and really think about the people and thinking more holistically about the systems that produce a healthy climate, that sustain us, and we include people-centric metrics as well, like energy equity, and how justice and doing justice is expressed as we build a clean energy future. And we see a very different picture. And we see one that includes our rural communities, and which are well represented here today. And I do want to just say thank you to everyone for sharing a little bit about where you sit and where you stand and what kind of utility serves you, because I'm certain that that will shape our conversation today. So the image before you on the screen here is from the heyday of rural electrification in America. It was developed by Lester Bial, and it was about rural power. And it was almost 100 years ago when the US, like many other places, found that there was an extraordinary gap, chasm really, between the have and have-nots of electricity. And farm communities in particular were left without the lights on by an electric power sector in the US that was entirely owned and driven by private corporations who made the claim that it just wasn't economically viable to take power to the farm, and that electricity was really a luxury good that was only for those who could afford it. And the country came together and made a very different decision that was expressed by the Rural Electrification Administration, and that led to the development of hundreds, nearly 1,000 actually, rural electric cooperatives and a couple of thousand public power utilities across the country that took matters into their own hands. They organized locally into nonprofit, and in the case of rural electric cooperative utilities, member-owned and governed utilities that turned the lights on for 95% of America within only about 5 years, and did it in a way that brought greater prosperity to our rural communities too, and healed some of the economic divides that were present at that time in our country. And we are here in a very similar space today, not only as we look at clean power, as we look at clean power's cousin, broadband, and as we're in a moment in which, that our country, through the Inflation Reduction Act, is getting ready to make an unprecedented since the 1930s, investment in clean power in the power sector overall. So the question that really comes to mind for me, and one of the questions that I want us to explore today, is what are our local clean energy futures going to look like? How are we going to take this moment to really fundamentally reconsider and perhaps reform many of the values that underpin our energy systems, and interrogate them to ask, how can we make sure that in our generation, in this moment where we're building our local clean energy futures, that we're doing it in a way that advances equity, that heals economic divides, that invests reparatively in communities, and that drives a more just system. So as we talk about the story of clean power, I also wanted to share that this is my story too. I'm from a small town in rural Georgia. I'm from LaGrange, Georgia. My grandparents, here you see my Mama Nop and my Papa Nop, all worked in the cotton mills. And their homes, both my grandparents' families lived on the same street in Dunson Mill Village, were absolutely exemplary of the kinds of homes that many of our most energy burdened neighbors live in today. Mama's house was home to me, still is home to me in a way that no other place I've ever lived ever has been, probably ever will be. But when it got cold enough to freeze the pipes, my Mama and Papa would get a $300 plus electricity bill, a power bill. And that was just to keep the pipes from freezing. That didn't actually keep the house warm, mind you, because the bedrooms at my Mama and Papa's house didn't even have heat, and there was no air conditioning anywhere. But that kind of bill was backbreaking. And it wasn't because the power was that expensive, it was because the house was that inefficient. And that same legacy continues today. And it was very much a part of my inspiration in writing this book, not only as it relates to my own experience with the haves and have-nots of rural power, but also the experience more broadly in the community where I grew up, which is still very, very shaped by histories of racism and housing segregation that mean that communities of color in my hometown pay even bigger energy bills, which are rooted in housing inequities that can also be healed as we think about how we build local clean energy futures. And I wanted to invite and share that in all the topics that we talk about today, that they're included in the book that I just published through Island Press, Rural Renaissance, which is all about how we can revitalize our hometowns through clean power. And for everyone here on the webinar today, using this discount code, gets a 30% discount if you choose to purchase the book, which I wrote really as, hopefully you all would find it inspirational, but certainly as a very practical how-to put these ideas into practice. So, why does a rural renaissance matter? Not only are we in a point where we really have to recognize as members and as contributors to the energy and sustainability movements that the way that we have worked and I would say the technocratic culture that has been bred, into our field by the by the imperative that we really be perfect, in making that bottom line return on investment argument to be able to get the attention of CEOs, the C-suite, the boardroom, to make a commitment to sustainability, but that we've missed what is more than 50% of America in the process. When we think about our 924 rural electric cooperative utilities, they serve about 50% of the US land mass. Public power utilities expand that aperture even further. And I know that many of you represented on the webinar today are served by public power utilities. Public power utilities are, of course, nonprofit utilities as well, that are a part of municipal governments and that have a very different set of priorities and governing principles than investor-owned utilities that are ultimately beholden to their stakeholders. So this is an extraordinarily large part of our country that in many cases has been overlooked. And it serves a lot of people too. And while investor-owned utilities serve the majority of US customers of electricity, publicly owned utilities and rural electric cooperatives serve more than 42 million commercial customers and households. And if we embrace the idea of building an equitable, clean energy future that really works for everyone, we've got to consider how these utilities work and operate a bit differently and make sure that solutions are available to the tens of millions of people that they serve too. Now, very importantly, rural electric cooperative service territories in particular also correlate with where the most energy burdened communities in the United States are located. And we're going to share a link in the chat with all of you to a set of resource publications and research that can help you explore that a bit more if it's a topic of interest. So in those really, deeply red areas here on the map, those are places where our low-income neighbors, households that are getting by on the least, are paying more than 20% of their total household income to keep their homes lit and warm and cool. So that's a huge energy bill, 20% of total household income. And in fact, when we think about it, even from the state level, there are 7 states in the US where the average low-income energy burden is greater than 20%, ranging even up to 40%. So imagine, if you will, or perhaps this is part of your personal experience or your family's experience or the experience of, friends and colleagues in your community, paying 40% of your entire household income to your electric and natural gas utility. It's an extraordinary burden. And as we move into the winter months, with natural gas prices still quite high, that's a burden that's going to get even heavier, particularly for rural families who depend on bottled gas, like propane or heating oil to keep their houses warm. So why are rural energy burdens so extraordinarily heavy, greater even than energy burdens in urban communities, that may range upwards of 10, even, approaching 20%? Well, it's definitely not because rural families use more power or because rural cooperatives and public power utilities have more expensive power. In fact, many rural co-ops and public power utilities have less expensive energy than investor-owned utilities. The reason for these heavy energy burdens is really rooted in housing inequities. Oftentimes, rental housing in rural communities are single-family homes that are old, that may be a little larger than the typical apartment in an urban community. And because of persistent poverty and because of the economic declines in many parts of rural America, these are homes that no one's paid any attention to from a repair and maintenance perspective in a very, very long time. So that leaves residents, people who live in these communities, people who are trying to raise families in rural communities in an extraordinary difficult position, facing many difficult choices. Do you keep the lights on? Do you keep the heat on? Or do you buy groceries? Do you buy medicine? Do you buy school supplies? How do you make ends meet when you don't know until the end of the month whether you're going to get clobbered with your electricity bill? And this is a very typical experience for rural electric cooperatives. In fact, rural electric cooperative utilities serve more than 90% of the persistent poverty counties in America. So if part of our goal for the clean energy futures that we're building is to build equitable futures, where the investments that we're making in clean power and infrastructure are helping to lift more people out of poverty and close our gaping economic divides, then we have got to invest in rural America. And we've got to do it in a way that understands and appreciates that the energy systems and structures that serve rural communities are just different than they are in urban areas. So here are our 7 states with the most energy burden. I'm curious if any of the folks on the call today are representing any of these. You might anticipate Alaska being there, but what about Mississippi? What about South Carolina? What about people in Alabama, low-income households who are paying nearly 21% of their entire household income for electricity and heat for their homes? These are problems that we can solve. But they're problems that we have to really understand and understand deeply first. I want to also bring broadband into the conversation because broadband is a clean energy technology. It's close cousin. You got to have broadband, you got to have high-speed internet to be able to deliver a smart grid. And rural electric cooperative utilities and public power utilities in many places are also ideal partners to get broadband as an affordable service, out to rural households, which enables community economic development too. And when we consider not only, think about the previous slides and the previous images, where are the places that are served by rural cooperative and public power utilities? Where are the most deeply energy burdened communities in America? There's a very high correlation with the places that also don't have access to broadband internet. And these are problems that we can approach and that we can work towards solving all at once with the institutional infrastructure that we have in place. So now I want to shift into telling some stories about how we can do that. The first story I want to tell is about SOUL, Save on Utilities Long Term, which is a program that Groundswell, the organization I lead, is implemented in my hometown in LaGrange. Now, let's think back to the maps about where those energy burdens are. And let's consider our neighbors who have very deep energy burdens in particular. How do we begin to address those needs as we build a clean energy economy? And how do we do it in a way that also appreciates and navigates the fact that many of the small utilities that are serving these communities may struggle to make ends meet on their own? While rural cooperative and public power utilities were really established with a mission of community economic development, right? It's not about utility profits, it's about community economic development. Because of the flight, of people and tax revenues and business from many communities, they may be a little thin on resources themselves. So, and seeking to meet the needs of our neighbors in my hometown of LaGrange, we looked at a solution called Pay As You Save. And it's like solutions that some of you may be familiar with for the way that companies have paid for, energy savings, paid for with savings up front. It's applying that same idea, at the residential level. And it's doing it as a service on the energy bill. So people are not excluded from participating in this program because they may not have good credit scores, or because they may not have access to financing, or because they may not be able to take on any household debt, because the SOUL program and the PAYS model finances all of those wonderful energy efficiency improvements directly on someone's utility bill. So the obligation to repay that initial upfront investment in residential energy efficiency follows the meter, not the person. And this is a really, really important point because many people who rent their homes may move more frequently even than people who may own their homes. So making sure that we're not adding financial burdens to families while we're seeking to deliver energy efficiency that improves the health and quality of housing while reducing bills is an important consideration that we've got to take into account here. But part of the story of implementing this program, and it's the story I tell in Rural Renaissance, is at its core a story about housing equity. And in my hometown of LaGrange, like in many places across America, the story of today's housing is deeply shaped by our past of housing segregation and racist housing policies, including redlining. So in LaGrange, where a lot of housing, particularly rental housing, is what we would call mill village houses. These are homes that were built by the cotton mills, by textile companies in the 1940s to house their workers. Homes that were built for our Black and African American neighbors were never built properly to begin with. But those homes, those structures still exist today. And with respect for the fact that every one of them houses a family, and just like my mama's house, it may not be efficient. The home may have a lot of problems, but it is still home. We've got to think in a reparative framework when we approach energy efficiency. When we began implementing this program, we started with the data. So we knew that the average energy burden in Troup County, Georgia, in the broader county, in the broader rural community, was almost 18%. And we knew that we had more than 1,500 residents in low-income neighborhoods in LaGrange who were paying 20% more than the average resident for electricity. So bottom line, we had more than 1,000 neighbors who were really strapped by how much it was costing them to light and heat their home every month. And we were able to pinpoint, exactly where those homes were. Now, I'm a glass half full kind of person. I'm ever the optimist. And I thought to myself, okay, we can go in with our partners. We can go in with the LaGrange Housing Authority. We can go in with the city utility, and we can knock on the doors of the people who can benefit the most from this program and get them relief. Get them relief in the form of weatherization, insulation, and in many cases, new air conditioning and heating units that would drop their bill and improve their home. Well, what I didn't anticipate, and what I don't think any of us anticipated, was that more than 50%, of the residents that we engaged, more than 50% of the homes whose doors we knocked on, had such significant repair and maintenance issues that we couldn't even begin to weatherize them without making conditions worse, because of active roof leaks, because of mold, in some cases because of plumbing that wasn't connected under the house. So sewage was dropping directly into the crawl space, of these homes. And because in some cases, some of the roof leaks were so significant that there was a hole in the roof, and residents had simply closed the door on that room. So they didn't have to directly interact with it. But those conditions had been persisting for so long that they were beginning to erode the structural integrity of the homes. Now, I don't share these conditions with you as some sort of sensational statement. Just as a statement of the reality of the conditions that many people in our communities are living in, and of the challenges that we all have to be ready to face. And why it's so important, particularly on this call where you all are planners and leaders and policymakers and decision makers and civic leaders in your community, that we come together with our peers and colleagues to find solutions that work for everybody by bringing all of our resources to the table. In the case of Seoul, we looked at how can we collaborate, not just with the housing authority, but with local foundations, with Habitat for Humanity, with other small nonprofits to get people the repairs and maintenance that they need on the way to a more energy efficient home that's saving them money. Today, more than a year after beginning to implement a pilot program so that we could learn and improve and perfect and make the experience better and better for people who are participating, we've got more than 60 people enrolled. On average, they've cut their utility bills by more than 30%. And that's an overall energy savings of more than $500 a year per participating household. And perhaps equally as important as all those savings are the fact that people are living in more comfortable, healthier homes that really respect their dignity as people and that express the love that we have for our neighbors. We have far from solved all the challenges that we face, but we're making progress. And it's a great example of a place that all of us can start. As someone, again, who's been in this field for a very long time, I think energy efficiency often gets short shrift. It's the least sexy of our clean energy solutions, but you know what? It is often the best place to start. And it is something that we can do everywhere. I would just encourage you all to think creatively about how you can bring friends to the table so that you're prepared both to see and quantify and understand exactly how deep the disparities are. And so you're equipped to use energy efficiency not only as a policy and a strategy for our climate and clean energy future, but really as a way to marshal reparative investments that support housing equity across our communities too. Solar. And this is a chart that Groundswell actually developed in a program where we were looking at how big corporate renewable energy purchases could really be leveraged for community benefits. But these ideas, I believe, embody important principled approach that we can take when we're developing solar or wind or other renewable energy projects anywhere. And it's really all about including communities. And I'll tell you a story actually from about 2 weeks ago. I was at a USDA event in Fitzgerald, Georgia. And Fitzgerald, Georgia is in sort of the center of South Georgia. It's an agricultural community. And I was talking to the mayor there, and we were talking about rural renaissance. And he was a forester by training. And he told me he didn't have anything against solar power. He didn't have anything against rural energy. But he really wanted to see where the benefits were for places like Fitzgerald. Because in Georgia, solar is big, for a variety of reasons related to the sort of lack of solar renewable energy credits and the way in which Georgia's energy markets are regulated. You can't really make a solar project pencil, at least not from a utility perspective, unless it's pretty big. And by big, I mean, upwards of 200-300 acres. So the biggest solar farm in Georgia is about 3,700 acres. And a typical solar size for a solar farm project would be somewhere between 700 and 1,000 acres. So that's a lot of land. That's a lot of land covered by solar panels in South Georgia. There's this one road you can take between Columbus and Macon where you're driving through Blakely. And on one side of the road is a cotton farm, and on the other side of the road is a solar farm. And both are enormous and stretch all the way out into the distance as far as you can see in the horizon. And it's a very poignant picture of the past and the future of South Georgia and of much of the American South. But for those solar farms to really be delivering equity and community benefits, we have to listen to what rural communities and the people who live there really want and need. And what the mayor of Fitzgerald said was that these solar farms were being built all over South Georgia, typically on former agricultural land, including land that may have been clear cut of timber that was harvested. And maybe, there was a little tax revenue associated with those projects. That is, so long as the economic development folks didn't give away the farm, literally, in tax abatement. But it wasn't the local residents who were getting discounted solar power from the cost savings that can come with solar. It wasn't local residents who were getting the tech jobs that a lot of that solar power was feeding when the solar farms were being built to back the renewable energy demands of companies like Google or Facebook or Amazon, which is actually now the largest consumer of renewable power globally. He didn't really see what was in it for the communities where the projects were located. And in a lot of ways, that's not so different from some of the extractive, energy practices of our past, where coal, for instance, was dug out of the ground and eastern Kentucky, burned somewhere far off in a power plant. But it was local people in Kentucky who got short shrift, without as good a paying jobs and burdened, by generations of pollution. So when we're thinking about how to build a rural renaissance, we got to think about our renewable energy development differently. There's extraordinary potential And we see that all over the place too, where the farms, for instance, where these projects are located, are generating sustainable multi-generational revenue for the people who own the land. We see solutions like agrovoltaics, which are one of my favorites, where solar and agriculture are existing together on places like Jack Solar Farm in Colorado, where the shade provided by the solar panels is actually increasing crop yields and helping to prevent dehydration, helping to reduce the amount of watering that's necessary, particularly as our climate is getting more extreme due to climate change. But that vegetation, those plants, the tomato plants, in some cases, tomatoes are one of my favorites at Jack Solar Farm, are also helping to keep the underside of those solar panels cooler, so they're producing more energy too, more efficiently. So higher crop yields, more solar power. It's a great way for solar and traditional agricultural practices to coexist. But we've got to be deliberate about how we do it. Investing in the process, which is at the very center of that circle, so that we're including all perspectives and not approaching building a clean energy future in the same way that the past of our extractive practices have increased economic divides and not healed them. We also have community solar. This is a little graphic about how community solar works, and community solar is marching out across more and more states in the US, and it is a solution that is beautifully matched in many of our international neighbors as well. And rural electric co-ops were actually early leaders in community solar. There are more community solar projects deployed in rural electric cooperative territory than in any other utility service territory across the country. And it kind of makes sense, right, from two perspectives. One, where rural electric cooperatives are really living up to their little d, democratic principles, the 7 cooperative principles on which they were founded. That idea of community scaled economies, energy working in service to community economic development, and members of the community working together are really beautifully embodied by community solar projects that share power, across a number of neighbors. And they also are a great match to rural electric cooperative utility business models. And in places like North Carolina, and Roanoke Electric Cooperative, actually in eastern North Carolina, is a beautiful example of this. Rural Renaissance is dedicated to Curtis Wynn, who was the former CEO there and former elected president of the NRECA, demonstrated this, that implementing community solar projects at like a distribution scale, so call it 5 to 10 megawatts, call it 5 to maybe 40 acres of solar farm, can also actually help reduce the cost of power for these small utilities when they face demand charges that jack up the cost of power for everybody at exactly the time when we need to be using the most power. A beautiful example of this, again, in Roanoke Electric Cooperative Service Territory, are a series of community solar projects that they developed with InterWealth Solutions, which was founded by Ajulo Othal. And these projects were located on historically Black family-owned farms. They included energy storage that also increased local community resilience in the utility service territory and helped to further shave down, reduce the cost of peak power for the utility. And not only did the farmers, who made their land available for those projects share as owners in the community solar project itself, but the savings that those projects created for the local utility were used to help pay for home repair and maintenance to enable more residents, many of whom were living below the poverty line in the community served by Roanoke Electric Cooperative, to make necessary home repairs so they could move into greater energy efficiency, so they could qualify for the programs that Roanoke Electric Cooperative operated. So beautiful examples for how community solar can fit in to a clean energy future. Oh, and here we have a beautiful illustration of our agrovoltaic example. I know if I had solar panels on my farm, I would really love to be growing some tomatoes under them. It reminds me of my Aunt Ada and my Mama Nop, who would always talk about the 3 sisters. three sisters that you grow together in the farm, in the garden, corn, squash, and beans. I like to think of solar panels as the fourth sister. Now, to be able to really realize this future, we got to make sure that the governance of our local cooperative, rural cooperative utilities and public power utilities are right. And there are many, many examples, and many of these I discuss in the governance chapter in the book, of where we've really drifted away from the original founding principles of our local energy democracies and how they're managed today. In fact, research reports from a number of advocacy organizations found that more than 90% of the elected board members of rural cooperative utilities across America were white men, very much not representative of the demographics of the communities that they serve. And there are many examples of how governance processes were being abused. While this may not describe every cooperative utility or what's in the hearts, of the people who are serving in leadership positions and serving on their boards, we have to deal with the facts of the matter and make sure that we've got our governing principles right to be able to move forward into a local clean energy future that's equitable, just, and democratically serving the people who actually own and control those utilities. Just to share a couple of examples, so you have an idea in your mind of some of the challenges that you may meet in your local communities. There are stories documented in South Carolina, in fact, where rural electric cooperative board members were paying themselves very generous salaries, generous particularly compared to what the area median income was, with generous benefits, and holding on to those seats for long periods of time without fully implementing the democratic requirements for board elections, to keep putting those dollars in their own pockets. That is absolutely out of alignment with the 7 cooperative principles that you see here. And ultimately, it was out of alignment with what the community wanted too, because those electric cooperative members came together, fired the board, and elected a new one. But not all the stories out there of little d democratic abuses among cooperative or public power utility governance, for that matter, have their happy ending yet. The failure to provide transparency of bylaws and practices like proxy voting can really obscure the fact that the people who are paying the utility bill really own and have control over how the utility itself is governed. So I would encourage everyone, when you're considering how to build out this future, to first take a look inwardly at how the utility you serve is governed. And be prepared to have the hard conversations. Democracy, working together in a democracy where we don't all agree is hard, even on a good day, but to be prepared to have those hard conversations about governance, to make sure that our principles are aligned, and so that we're moving forward based on good values. And I also want to uplift, when we're talking about the 7 cooperative principles, that these ideas didn't just come out of the ether. These ideas weren't sort of cleverly concocted by some industry trade association. The 7 cooperative principles actually have their roots in the worker revolutions that were responding to just the extraordinary negative impact that industrialization had on working families' health, wealth, and well-being. And they were formed and expressed, for instance, by the Rochdale Society in Manchester, England, that first began to write these things down in a governing framework. And they inspired and shaped and fundamentally formed rural electric cooperative utilities here in America. And while 70 years ago, when these institutions were being created at the same time that the New Deal was advancing, the Tennessee Valley Authority and the originary idea of public power in America, we were also implementing racist policies like redlining as the law of the land. So we also have to be very deliberate about unpicking and uprooting many of the roots, the inequitable and racist roots of our governing systems, to make sure that we're living up to first principles and their promise as we're moving forward into a future. So, as I conclude the presentation component of the conversation here, and we move forward towards Q&A and what I hope will be a very robust discussion among the group of leaders and who are represented on the call today, I would just invite you again to check out the full story, the story of rural power in America and how we can work together to build local clean energy futures that are really founded on energy values, on systems of values that will produce the kind of equitable and just futures, not just for us, but for our children, our children's children, and generations to come. And that we take this moment where we are seeing a level of investment in our energy systems and our rural infrastructure that hasn't been seen in 100 years in America, and that we put it to good purpose for all it's worth. Because while we certainly face no end of challenges, whether we consider that question on the national, international, or on the local or personal scale, we're all blessed to be alive at a time where every change that we make, every decision we take, every step we move forward together, is building a legacy for the future. And we have that responsibility and that blessing, today in our time. So I'm going to pass the baton back over for us to begin the Q&A session of our discussion.
Great, thank you, Michelle, and thank you to everybody who's here today. We are putting you on the screen there, so thanks for turning your camera on. And we've received many questions here. We'll go through them, and if anybody wants to send any more questions, please do so through the questions tab. And we'll keep going till we either run out of time or run out of questions. So the first question here is from Alex Long, who's asking, what are your thoughts about small-scale nuclear power?
Well, thank you so much for that question. And, I first learned about small-scale nuclear power when I was serving in the Obama administration. And at that time, it was a discussion, not something that had been demonstrated yet, at least not at the utility scale, between the Navy and Oak Ridge National Laboratory. It was kind of a glimmer in the eye. And today, actually, in Tennessee Valley Authority's service territory, there's a proposed project moving forward that would demonstrate that technology. And, we have, again, at this moment where we're investing in our clean energy future, a way that all these technologies, small modular nuclear, solar, energy storage, even many of the ways that EVs can be used as energy storage on our grid systems, can create local power, local investment, local jobs, enrich local economies. And, to be able to embrace those new technologies and continuously improve on them, is one more way that we can build our local clean energy futures, always taking into account what the local community's priorities and needs and concerns may be. And as it relates to any new technology, making sure that we do it with the utmost respect to health and safety.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Next question here is from Kirby Date, who asks, I have worked with several rural communities where there's a broadband, but there's only one service provider and the prices are outrageous. What is the solution to this?
I would say solutions. And one of the things that I learned when I was researching a rural renaissance is that there's so many things about rural broadband today in the policy and the many economic challenges that we're facing that really mirror where we were in the 1920s and 30s when we were trying to get power to the farm. And there was this idea that was ultimately disproven that it was too expensive, to run the last mile infrastructure to farming communities. And there was also extraordinary resistance to public power, to rural electric cooperatives, to self-organizing and self-reliance coming from the incumbent utilities of the day. And a lot of the big broadband providers, big companies whose names we would all recognize, have been opponents of rural electric cooperatives and public power utilities getting into that business at the local level. While at the federal level, I know there's been an extraordinary and escalating investment in rural broadband infrastructure, billions upon billions of dollars available to build out that last mile to make sure that rural families, that rural businesses have access to broadband, and that and we can attract more rural businesses by being able to offer high-speed internet. There's a mayor in North Carolina who very pointedly said, no one wants to locate their business where the internet sucks. And, he's right. But we've got to get over a lot of obstacles to do that. There have been some important steps that have been taken for the FCC to update their broadband maps. You guys may be familiar with what's a technical but a very important issue is the broadband maps, that shaped where federal dollars were available to be able to build broadband infrastructure were wrong. So they grossly underrepresented where businesses and where residents were lacking access to broadband. In fact, my home state of Georgia, they built their own maps. They collected their own data, to demonstrate just how wrong the FCCs were. And there was even a little spat within the federal family of other agencies producing maps that more accurately represented the gap. So that data gap, that misinformation that was out there that was depriving people of broadband access and access to the federal dollars that were meant to build that infrastructure is on its way to being corrected. But at the state level, and I'm not quite sure which state you're in, but there are many challenges as well, where some of those incumbent utilities, may kind of play nice in Washington to be able to camp out on, the rural communities where, where there's not access to broadband. They bid very aggressively in the reverse auctions that the FCC runs to be able to provide service and get those federal dollars to provide service to communities that don't have access. But, they may be squatting on those territories, owning them from the perspective of federal subsidies, but not actually providing the service, while also preventing rural electric cooperatives from providing that service themselves. And in many cases, it's state policy that's necessary to fix that. State policy that's necessary to say, hey, rural electric cooperatives, you can be in the broadband business. Or, rural electric cooperatives, you can use the same transmission lines, the same high-speed internet infrastructure you have built to manage your utility to make that accessible to be able to provide last-mile residential broadband service to, very technically complex questions from a policy perspective, that any leaders represented here today on this call or among your communities who can really, dig into that, understand what the policy landscape is at your state level, connect with some of the leaders at NRECA like Curtis Wynn, who has fought many of these battles in North Carolina, can help point you towards some of the solutions that can heal those divides. Solutions like rural electric cooperatives have demonstrated in Virginia, where there's shared transmission infrastructure to make getting broadband to rural communities a little less expensive. Examples like kudzu networks in Georgia, where rural broadband is available for, I think, about $50 per month because they just created and started their own service. Many bad examples that you don't want to follow too, but I think that the technical complexity is represented in a more and more fulsome way in the literature. And Rural Renaissance has many examples and many citations for places that you can go and leaders that you can talk to too, just to understand, hey, like this is the challenge we're facing in my state or in my region. How did you tackle it? So I can follow and learn from your example too.
Great, thanks, Michelle. And again, thanks to everybody for submitting questions. And you can continue to submit them through the questions tab. So just to move on here, next one here is there any thought as to why industry leaders in energy are not diversifying their portfolio to greater include clean power, or is it simply a matter of retaining the status quo because the infrastructure already exists and the profit margin it currently generates?
I can tell you, I mean, I'll answer that question from the perspective of my own experience. And as y'all may have heard in my bio, early in my career and for a little more than a decade in my career, I was part of the U.S. Green Building Council and part of the green building movement and helped to build that marketplace from a corporate perspective, as well as from a nonprofit perspective. And real estate is one of the largest energies. It is the largest asset class in the world. And any of y'all who have tried to even renovate your own bathroom know that it takes a small army, even to build something relatively small, much less something as complicated as like a commercial building or a whole new district or redevelopment in a city or in any small town. It's a lot of work. It takes a lot of people, and it takes a lot of minds coming together. And trying to, work from within and in harmony and alignment with that industry towards greater sustainability. It took extraordinary coordination and extraordinary unity and a sense of fellowship and alignment across a shared set of measures and metrics that could keep that army of folks in the construction, real estate, and finance industry all moving forward together in harmony. It's no small feat, and it's not something that happened overnight either, because at the end of the day, most people don't love change. Many institutions resist change, not because change is bad, but just because it's hard. And that's something that I think that we can all understand and appreciate, empathetically, just as people. Sure, we all have those examples from our past or even from our present, where we're going through changes that may not be so fun. And when we're talking about the energy industry being transformed towards abundant sources of renewable power and all these different distributed, localized technologies, my God, that's a big change. And that's a big change that involves a lot of people and that impacts a lot of industries. And even where it makes bottom line sense, even where it's what people want, can still take a long time. Groundswell develops community solar and community resilience projects. They're not that big. A megawatt is pretty big for us, and a lot of them are located on local churches, but it's not unusual for them to take 1 to 2 years to build. But that's the first time, right? It just takes patience and faithfulness and commitment to get that first project done. And then, as Ray Anderson always said, you change the world one mind at a time. We all learn together, and the second and the third one are easier. So when we're thinking about transforming our local utilities and our utility systems and our local energy systems, think about it as one project at a time, one mind at a time. We're not trying to boil the ocean here. And even in the context of, in fact, we're trying not to boil the ocean. But even in the context of the US, our entire energy policy landscape is federalism at work. This country is not designed for monolithic one-size-fits-all solutions. We have the opportunity to make local decisions at the local level. So, from my perspective, I think we can really release ourselves from the anxiety and fear and anger over disagreements about one way to do things, at the national level, and really focus a little bit closer to home. Start moving the ball forward, get something done that helps people, and use that as the light to guide your path.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Next question here is from Hannah Mulroy, who asks, in the program where you budgeted for the weatherization of older homes, I understand that you ran into issues you didn't expect, but did you plan from the get-go to budget for non-weatherization aspects of the projects, for example, new flooring, paint, fixtures, etc.?
It's a great question. I'm so appreciative that you asked that. In the beginning, of the program, we knew that we would run into some challenges. We knew that there would be repair and maintenance issues that had to be overcome, to be able to get to the energy efficiency. We estimated, and this was not based on data, right? This was based on, just people from the community saying, yeah, we're going to run into these issues, and it's present in some homes. So we thought, okay, maybe 10 to 20% of the homes that we assessed for the SOL program would need other types of repair and maintenance issues first. Never in a million years did we think it would be 53%, which was the actual number. 53% of the hundreds of homes that we've been to needed repair and maintenance first before they could proceed into energy efficiency. And that 53% was pretty evenly split between more minor repair and maintenance issues, call it $2,000 to $3,000 of stuff you had to fix before you could install insulation, to about half of that 53% being much more serious, call it $12,000 to $15,000 of repairs that were necessary to be able to proceed. So in the get-go, we had a plan, and that plan was for a aligned pilot program in LaGrange that was focused on investing in healthier homes for local residents that we could work together. So at a very tactical level, if a home was assessed for soul and it required repair and maintenance to be able to proceed, then we would refer that home, that resident, to the Healthy Homes program, which could undertake a more comprehensive, retrofit, fixing roof leaks, fixing plumbing leaks, fixing rotted floors. And that program was led by South Base Energy Institute, which is also based in Georgia out of Atlanta, and then be referred back to Soul for energy efficiency. And if you're thinking about it from a sort of total amount of investment capital available to improve residential efficiency and residential equity in a community, that also maximizes all the dollars, right? You're using the philanthropic dollars, the grant dollars to fix stuff that doesn't have an economic return. And then you're using kind of utility bill-based financing mechanisms to pay for the stuff that saves more than it costs over time. And it was a good plan, but ultimately the amount of funding that was available was just inadequate. And not inadequate because anybody was bad, but inadequate because none of us realized just how extensive the issues were. And, one of mine, not more than a hope, into planning territory, not just for LaGrange, but for all the rural communities that we want to be able to serve. Excuse me. Little allergies, y'all. Directly and also just through sharing our stories, is that, funding that's available through the Inflation Reduction Act, USDA funding for housing preservation, light heat funding that's available to repair homes and get them ready for energy efficiency, HUD dollars, local philanthropic dollars, basically dollars from anywhere you can get them to close these gaps in housing equity can be applied here, together with, what are other kinds of rebates, tax credits, refundable tax credits that are in that bill as well, that apply directly to residents, to the people who are living in homes that need improvements. I would say the challenge for any of us, whether we're, a person, a head of a household who's paying way too much for electricity and needs these solutions, as policymakers, as business or nonprofit leaders, is that it's so complicated, right? It's so incredibly complex because you have to take a little bit from here and a little bit from there and a little bit from there and figure out how to make the money all work together and fill out all the applications and make all the reports and keep all your time and the way that you have to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's hard. No joke, it's hard. But I would say it's worth it, not only in service and just the joy of service to our communities, but it's worth it as many of us who, I'm a former government official, many of y'all are current government officials, public servants. It's worth it, as stewards of those resources, to make sure we're getting as much out of them as we can, and just figuring out some way to paper over all the cracks between the programs that we're trying to bring, to serve a single family from, 20 or 50 different sources of support.
Good, thanks, Michelle. And thanks for going into detail on these questions. I appreciate that information. Next question here is from Bill Pugh, who's asking, how can ex-urban communities deal with the proliferation of data centers and their huge energy and transmission line needs?
This is such a hard question. The community that my husband and I live in Midlothian, Virginia, is facing some of these questions as well. Data centers and also from distribution centers. that have huge energy needs. There is I would point to a specific opportunity here in a specific place of engagement, right? Because being able to solve these problems and come up with solutions that are going to be good for communities, are going to have benefits for communities, and that are going to have right answers from a land development perspective is going to be all about dialogue, but it's also going to be very place-based. A solution in Chesterfield County, Virginia, may not be the same solution for exurban communities in the upper Midwest, for instance, or in the American West, where there are a whole different kettle of fish in terms of even not just what the infrastructure, but what some of the climate challenges are too. So there is a group that Groundswell has worked with, and they were partners actually in that little chart that I showed you about mechanisms for aligning corporate renewable energy purchases with community benefits. And it's CEBA, the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance. It used to be called REBA, the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, which I found super easy to remember because my Mama Nop was such a big Reba McEntire fan. But CEBA has actually built a whole community of practice around answering this very question. Now, CEBA's membership is composed of the 300 odd corporations, including all those tech companies that are the biggest purchasers of renewable energy globally, not just in the US. And this community of practice is focused on answering the question, how can the way that those companies are buying renewable energy for those data centers, for example, help to increase equity and better align with community priorities than the way it's happening today, which can be extractive, which can be very disconnected from the communities, not only where the data centers are located, but also where the energy projects are located that are feeding those data centers. And so I would invite you, thank you, and then John has put a link to CEBA in the chat. I would invite you to either reach out directly to me. I'd be happy to make the connection to folks on that team who are leading the work, or reach out directly to CEBA and get involved, because they are inviting members of impacted communities, environmental justice leaders, community leaders, civic leaders, to be a part of that conversation, so that it's not just the big tech giants of the world who are deciding, well, this is the way we shall, and we're the smartest people in the room, and it's going to be our way. We're not even going to ask you a question. They're working to create collaborative solutions. So they're increasingly aware of the impact that they have, and they're seeking to be, at the end of the day, better neighbors.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Next question here is from Ann Watson, who's asking, what is your position on the use of prime farmland for renewable energy systems?
This is a really important question to ask and answer at the local level. I was talking a couple of months ago, actually, to a legislative leader from North Carolina, and he represented a rural community, and this was exactly his concern. What about areas where we have, prime farmland, where we have really special, beautiful soil, and those lands are being either purchased or leased for renewable energy development, and they're being taken out of productive use for agriculture anyway. And he was also further concerned that the energy infrastructure that was being built on those properties might somehow change the land, either change the landscape, because the way the civil engineering was done on the property, or that 35 years from now, when those solar panels were no longer being used, that the owners of the project would just leave them disused as debris and not clean up their mess, so to speak. But these are all answers. I mean, number one, as I shared, that can be best answered at the local level by local leaders, as it relates to land planning and zoning. There's some wonderful tools that are available from national research entities like the National Renewable Energy Lab. Because when we look at, okay, where are the prime areas for producing solar energy or wind power for that matter, it's really a very small percentage of the US land mass that's necessary. And from a technical and scientific perspective, there are places, some places are better than other places. But in part because our utility map from a market and from a policy perspective, the energy markets in America, it looks like a big crazy quilt. regions, sometimes states, localities, different building codes, different zoning codes, different utilities. It can be hard to make it all work together, and we tend to want to kind of cram things in, sometimes to places that they don't best fit. But very much in the spirit of planning for sustainability, right, which is about understanding systems of systems and how they connect and how they can be best optimized together. We can step back and take that kind of thoughtful, planful, data-informed approach, so that we're not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, but so that we're making thoughtful decisions about how we want to use our land today for the benefit of tomorrow's generations. And I would, call to mind my friend Ari Wallach, who actually just released a book called Long Path. He's a futurist and really a prophet in my mind. And he frames it this way: he challenges us all to be great ancestors. So what are the land use planning decisions that we need to make today that make us great ancestors to the generations of tomorrow, so that we have access to prime agricultural land, and we're really respecting and celebrating and uplifting, the beauty of agriculture and of that land use. And we're also, making room in the right places for solar, for wind, and for sources of clean power that not only ensure a healthier future for us all, but that also bring our energy systems closer to the local level. And we can do both. And we can also, as I shared in my agrovoltaic and pollinator-friendly PV example for that matter, there are places where it makes sense for those land uses to align, and where we're actually preserving the agricultural productivity of land by incorporating solar power too.
Great,
I love the detailed questions, y'all.
Yes, no, we have more coming. So again, thanks everybody for submitting them. Here's one from Cheryl Watson, who's asking, how can a small unincorporated low-income farming community take on energy sovereignty when the county is adversarial?
Oh, that's a hard question. And I know you knew it was a hard question when you asked it. So I'm just stating the obvious there. I think that there, the local politics and the local structures of governance I'm not familiar with, so it's hard for me to answer that aspect of the question. But I think that there are a couple of places to potentially look. One may be, focusing on a particular, particular technical solution, and one that in my experience has been not only well matched, to the scope of benefits that you'd be looking for, like energy sovereignty, probably energy cost savings as well, and wealth building through ownership, would be to consider resilience as an option. Resilience would be solar and energy storage together on a microgrid, and you can build other, bits and pieces into that as well, like EVs or smart appliances. And resilience has an overall public benefit, even from a county or statewide emergency management perspective. And it's a solution that's being more and more widely embraced. And from an energy sovereignty perspective, you're also able to keep your energy system more, still connected to the grid from a safety perspective and health perspective, but more contained. And there's an element also of the Inflation Reduction Act that I think is critically important to uplift here, in terms of the potential for energy sovereignty, energy democracy, and connecting energy to economics and wealth building for communities. And that is the fact that in the Inflation Reduction Act, it adds a 10% kind of plus up for renewable energy and storage projects that are located in underserved or in energy transition communities. That's a mouthful, but basically it means that if you're in, a former coal community, or if you're in a community that may be in an opportunity zone, for example, or low income census tract, then you can get 40% of the value of that project as a tax credit, number one, up to 40%. Number two, the tax credit is now fully refundable. So that means if you're a nonprofit entity, that nonprofit could be public power utility or rural electric cooperative. It could also be a community-based organization or a church or a farming cooperative. Then you can get the value of that tax credit as a refund. Now that's a game changer, because up until now, you'd have to bring in a tax equity investor. They would take some of the benefit of that tax credit in profits. And ultimately, what the tax credit before it was refundable meant is that the federal government was paying the wealthy to be landlords over those who don't have wealth, and forcing those who didn't have wealth to pay rent or pay more, and pay it in perpetuity. So I would, just commend to you that you consider resilience as a starting point, and think about how some of the changes in the ITC from the IRA, because y'all, it's not energy if it doesn't have a incomprehensible acronym attached to it. But consider what those changes mean to connecting to your community development priorities, and maybe think about that as a starting point for negotiation, and for making sure that you're getting the biggest scope of benefits that you can out of that initial project, and then use that initial demonstration to build momentum, even in the hardest places and spaces where we've worked. Just showing people what a more equitable energy future can look like can build support and build momentum where none existed before, or where it was just a hard slog. It can turn a hard slog into a steady march.
Okay, thank you. I guess change the topic a little bit in terms of the questions. Next one here is Paola Diaz, who asking, how are community banks engaged with clean energy financing? And what broadband financing resources are you aware of for banks?
This is a great question. And community development financial institutions, CDFIs, are becoming increasingly, sorry guys, increasingly active in this space. And there are a couple of them that I can shout out. One is a relatively newly created community bank, and that is on the journey to becoming a CDFI. That is Rochdale Capital. It was founded and is led by John Holtzclaw, who is based in North Carolina, and it was spun out of the National Cooperative Bank. And there's a whole community of CDFIs that's being convened by the University of New Hampshire. And the University of New Hampshire is running a whole learning program to really teach CDFI leaders and lenders how to underwrite clean energy projects. And like I said, clean energy and broadband are very closely connected. So there is a growing field and a growing understanding, I would say, for for how these projects can and should be financed. And research that Groundswell is contributing to that question through a DOE-funded research project we've been leading called Lift Solar Everywhere, because again, y'all, it's not energy if it doesn't have an acronym, is seeking to answer that question at a very granular level. Specifically, how, given the regulatory and market infrastructure in your state, the type of utility service territory you're building your project in, how can you optimize for the maximum access to solar or clean energy or other technologies and its benefits through the structure of the project financial model? There's some research available at the link to Groundswell Labs that John shared earlier, but there's a whole toolkit with a kind of an online widget, Project Optimizer, that's meant to connect people directly to case studies and directly to solutions, data, recommendations, you name it, so that we can all move forward faster together, because there is such local diversity, because we are in a federalist energy policy environment, and because energy markets themselves are so complicated and complex, and technologies are changing, and the costs are coming down all the time. But the combination of those things means that there's no one-size-fits-all solution. So we always have to look a little deeper. But bottom line, I would say, for understanding where CDFIs and community financing fit into the picture, check out the resources available from University of New Hampshire. Eric Hangen is the leader of that program. And check out the publications on Groundswell's website on optimal project finance structures for expanding LMI access.
Thank you. Next question here is a little bit lengthy with some background and comments, so I'll read it to you. From Jay Lambrix, who says, Do you think that district geothermal heating and cooling systems would be an effective way to reduce overall energy usage and allow for wind and solar to completely replace fossil fuel usage in rural and native communities? The focus tends to lean heavily towards individual household geothermal systems, but district geothermal would allow communities to harness economies of scale and reduce the cost of such systems. It could be a great opportunity for mining companies to also extract lithium with minimal environmental impacts, while simultaneously providing heating and cooling. And this could be an extra source of income for these communities.
Thank you for uplifting that solution. You know, it's I know less about it than I do, you know, solar and resilience and the kind of things that I've been practicing for the past several years. But I do know that district heating and cooling and district level geothermal is a solution that's been very effectively implemented by college and university campuses, and in some cases by US military bases. And we may not think about military bases as being community, but they're really like, you know, not so small cities, all within the context of their fence line. And so it can be a proven, a very well proven technological solution. And I would add that, and this is going to be part of the answer to everything, right? Because the Inflation Reduction Act was an almost 700-page piece of legislation. There's a lot in there, y'all. There are also some very, very significant incentives for geothermal, both on the tax credit side, on the rebate side at the household level, and probably on the R&D side as well. So if that technology is a good match for where you are, from the resources that you have abundantly, and you know, looking at what we have in abundance and really being grateful for what we have in abundance and putting that to good purpose instead of, you know, obsessing over what we don't have, is definitely one of the principled approaches that I recommend we take in rural renaissance. It can be a great place to start and a great complement to some of the other technologies that we're talking about.
Great, thank you. Next question here is from Chris Carrick, who's asking, are there federal grants for rural electric co-ops to develop solar farms to serve their customers?
There are so many USDA grants for rural communities. It's almost bewildering. And there are more in the Inflation Reduction Act. In fact, in the Inflation Reduction Act included almost $10 billion in funding for rural electric cooperatives to expand clean energy. And so there's an abundance of opportunity. And then remember too that the refundability of the ITC, you know, of the solar and clean energy and renewable energy tax credit applies to rural electric co-ops too, because they're nonprofit institutions. And so rural electric cooperatives that develop and want to own their own sources of clean power can get the value of that tax credit back now as a refund. Before it wasn't accessible. Because nonprofits aren't taxable. They don't have any need for tax credits. So that's a game changer too. And then finally, and this is, you know, different than grant funding, there's also lots and lots of very low cost capital, very low cost financing available through USDA and also through the National Cooperative Bank, NRCFC, I think, again, acronym, but NRCFC. Exactly for these purposes. So at the end of the day, between grant funding and a very, very diverse source of grant funding through USDA and sometimes also through private foundations, and those grants from USDA also include grant funding directly to farms and to rural businesses to help install things like solar or biomass or biogas and energy storage. There's just an unprecedented since the 1930s, you know, amount of resource available, really investing in rural power. So the challenge is going to be complexity, but on the other side of that complexity is a wealth of opportunity. And rural development, the USDA Rural Development Office actually has a listserv you can sign up for, and they will inundate you. In fact, they won't just email you; they will inundate you with funding announcements. And rural development leaders at the state level all over the US can also talk you through exactly what kind of programs would be a good match for what you want to build, what you want to develop for your local community.
Thanks, Michelle. We'll just have time for a couple more questions here before we wrap up. So I'll ask you this one from Sarah Chemelak, who asks, how do you create partnerships and solicit private companies to bring in clean energy?
I would say the number one excuse me, the number one advice that I would have, or piece of advice that I would have for building partnerships, is focus on values alignment. Be very front-footed about expressing your values and your priorities, and making sure that you have values alignment in the partnerships that you're forming. You know, sometimes good intentions or good intentions that might be held very closely at the individual level with the, the human beings that are on either side of the partnership can be thwarted by institutional values or institutional cultures that might be out of alignment. So take the time and inquire deeply about values from the get-go, because ultimately systems, including partnerships, are going to produce outcomes based on the values that they're grounded in. The second piece would be, especially around renewable energy, get involved with SEBA. Reach out to them. They are convening entire working groups of corporations who are proactively seeking to have better, more authentic, more real connections with the communities, not just where their operations are based, but where the projects are based that are serving their energy appetites. And, sometimes it can be hard to build those relationships because you've got a little tiny energy procurement team and it's working off in Silicon Valley or somewhere else, working remotely. So it's hard to make those connections. But the interest is there. There's an open door. And SEBA is working on really defining how they can roll out a red carpet. And like I said, I'm happy to help make those connections.
Thank you. Next question here is, do you have any thoughts on how to shift the discourse on certain goods being public goods? We've seen so many items that would be considered public goods become commoditized, and one would think in this country that certain things would be insured as public goods.
That is there's so much bound up in that question, but I think that we are at a point where there is some conversation, there is discourse, particularly around broadband. For instance, being considered to be a public good and something that's really a necessity, and not a premium product, not a luxury that's just for the few. In fact, and I can't remember the gentleman's name, but there was a state legislator from Alabama, or maybe it was a public service commissioner from Alabama, who was quoted on this very fact, that very much like electricity in the 1930s, that we were at a point in time where broadband was really becoming a public good that needed to be treated as such, because it's something that everybody needed to have access to, whether you're talking about little kids and education, our elders and access to telehealth, or just the ability to run your business at the local level. And I find, and again, at the risk of repeating myself, but I'll do it anyway, that the way that we make change is really one mind at a time. And our media environment, social media, can really make us think that attention has value, that attention is substance. Attention is not substance. Getting a big pop in the press or big pop in social media, that's a moment, not a movement. And, what we need for the kinds of transformations of our communities that are necessary are movements. And movements begin with one heart and one mind at the time. And how do we do that? We do that by folks like folks on this call, having conversations at the local level and creating that momentum that eventually, comes together into a national decision we can make as a national community.
Great, thanks, Michelle. I've got one last question here from Tess Dornfeld, who's asking, I guess, a follow-up to what we were talking about earlier about the large energy users like data centers. And she's asking, how about large power users that have less interest or incentive in promoting clean energy? Our mining industry's energy needs are being used to justify the utilities' plans for a new gas plant.
Okay. I would say, and again, like coming from the building industry and building and construction, which is a very traditional industry, I used to laugh and tell folks it was the second oldest industry on the planet, but it can be very conservative and very entrenched. But even with the mining company, do they have peers or colleagues? Is there a sustainability director somewhere in the company? Are there people who work at the mining company who are also local residents, who would have a stake as individuals in beginning a conversation about the energy usage of that mining company as it relates to the energy future that the community wants to build. I think that we can, sometimes when it's convenient, corporations are citizens, and when it's not convenient, corporations are barely neighbors. And we need to recognize, though, as individuals, that we don't put on some uniform or costume when we go to work and divorce ourselves of our faith, values, or principles. We're whole people in the workplace, just like we're whole people at home. And appealing to those shared values and the shared future and the health and wealth and well-being and prosperity that we want all of us to have and to share at a human level. I have found, at least, to be as a fruitful avenue for appeal. Conversations are not always easy. Conversations are not even always successful in the near or medium term, but progress is possible. And connecting at that level of shared values, is it faith, is it family, is it community, is it nature, whatever it be, is a way to move the ball forward and to move the ball up the field.
Great, thank you. Well, given that it's 2:30, I think we'll wrap up the questions part. And again, thanks to everybody who submitted them, and we'll send everything over to Michelle that was submitted, as well as you saw that her contact information was there on the screen. But we did want to give you, I guess, one last chance to give us some closing thoughts and takeaways.
Well, for me, in closing, I would just share how what a joy it's been to be with all of you today on the webinar. I just appreciate so much this opportunity, not only to present some of my ideas and what I've learned, but to be in conversation with you. One of the things of my life that I'm most grateful for is to be part of a community of professionals and civil servants who are really committed to demonstrating love for the people that we serve, demonstrating love for our neighbors through the work that we do. And the conversations that we've had here today are certainly indicative of that. And it's leaving me with a smile to go into the rest of my afternoon.
Great, thank you very much. And thanks for being with us today. With that, we're going to conclude our webinar, Rural Renaissance, Revitalizing America's Hometowns Through Clean Power. I'd like to offer a giant thank you to Michelle Moore for a great presentation today, to everyone who attended, and to John Coleman, our communications and technology guru, who helps to make this all happen. The complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on smartgrowth.org. Also, for those of you who have requested one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for this follow-up email if you need the certificate to claim other continuing education credits. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. And finally, keep an eye on smartgrowth.org and your email inbox for details on future webinars, including City Forward, how innovation districts can embrace risk and strengthen community, which will be next Tuesday, September 27th. 2 days later, we will be hosting Farms Under Threat 2040, Choosing an Abundant Future with the American Farmland Trust. And then our annual Walktober Walk-in-Our series with the Maryland Department of Transportation will be on Thursday mornings in October. That information is available on the website. And finally, the Park Maker and the Form Giver, how Frederick Law Olmsted and Henry Hobson Richardson reinvented America's public spaces, which will be on Tuesday, October 11th. So please join us for these. And thanks for being here today, and hope you have a great rest of the day.